Hello. Hi. Hey. Hi, everyone. So I guess we're just going to get started. And because I don't want Kevin introducing me, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Paul Asadoorian. My day job is I'm a Principal Security Evangelist for a company called Eclypsium, which is a great place to work, a lot of fun, and we do cool firmware and supply chain things. I do podcasts as well. Currently, I do Paul Security Weekly, which is like in its 19th year of doing a podcast. So that's a lot of fun, and you should check that out. And this talk stemmed from me doing a podcast or two every week and observing the news and things happening in our industry, and I'm going, wow, that's kind of messed up. And then I'm like, well, that's also kind of messed up. And I'm like, these things kind of relate. And over time, I'm like, this could be a talk. And so that's how I came up with this talk, is everything you didn't want to know about CVE, because of all the kind of messed up things that I was observing in the wild doing my podcast and covering this stuff in the news. So I just want to start off with, like, how many people here have kids that you know of, right? That's my famous joke. And how many people have been on vacation with kids? And could you probably check all these boxes of bad things that have gone wrong on vacation? So I just went on vacation with my family, and thankfully we didn't lose a child. I mean, we have 3, so it's extras. And like illness-wise, we were good, but like pretty much everything else was a problem that we had to deal with. Now, how each and every one of us in this room would rank these problems on a severity scale is probably different, correct? The person in your family who may have to do response to one of these things is probably different. I had a whole conversation with my good friend Jeff about puke over lunch, about who responds to puke and telling stories about puke, and I will spare you any of those details. But the point is, we would have a different severity response and how emergency level that response is for any of these things, and it would be all different and unique to our own environments, which is the same thing with vulnerabilities and exploits, is the point. And so a lot of this talk is going to focus on the problems I've observed and my proposed solutions for dealing with how we collectively as an industry deal with vulnerabilities. So, are you the screw one side in really tight, both sides, or not screw it in at all, right? Yeah, everyone's different, isn't it? Yeah. All right. So I'm just going to run through the problems and solutions. So one of the problems I've observed is CVE lists the wrong version as being vulnerable. So the data that's coming from what we know and love from CVE is sometimes not very accurate. So what happens is there are organizations that can, so since anyone basically can create a CVE, these get reported into MITRE. MITRE publishes them, and it will state all versions up to and including are vulnerable. Oftentimes, especially with WordPress plugins, this is just simply not true. Yet, this data exists in the CVE database, and there's a lot of this data in the CVE database from CNAs, CVE numbering authorities. These are organizations that are authorized to issue their own CVEs. You would be surprised the top companies that have issued CVEs, the most CVEs issued by any particular CNA. Anyone want to venture to guess what the number 1 or even number 2 is? Who issued the CVE? Yeah. I heard Microsoft, Google, WordPress itself. You're close. The top ones do have something to do with WordPress. One of them is actually called PatchStack. And in their database today, if you go through and look at the vulnerabilities that they've reported, they all have that. Do I have a laser pointer on here? Yeah, they all have that less than or equal to, so that means all versions up to and including. And you can see this is just a snapshot of their page, and every single one of these here is listed. Now, I didn't go check to make sure that that was actually true, but based on what I've observed so far, I think it's probably not entirely accurate. And so then I started looking at, well, who is the number one? It turns out it's PatchStack. The second one on the list is VulDB. Now, VulDB has been around for a certain amount of time, like a long time, basically. They've got the whole company history there. I started going down the rabbit hole of like investigating the whole company. I'm like, all right, Paul, like reel the reins in on it. Got other things to talk about. The interesting part here is that each of these top CVE repository or reporters are not Microsoft, Google, or the ones you'd expect, right? It's PatchStack, it's VulDB, it's security advisories at GitHub, right? Then we've got Microsoft. We've also got WordFence and WPScan in there as well. I mean, I think what we can glean from that is WordPress is really just a cesspool, especially the plugins. But also there's a lot of people that like to report those and use that as marketing on their websites is the other thing I've observed as well. Which also I think like skews the data, right? Like, so how many vulnerabilities are reported? What's the severity of all of the reported vulnerabilities? That data gets skewed. You almost have to like remove WordPress plugins from that because of people who are reporting them and all the things that are wrong in the WordPress ecosystem, right? Which is like an entirely different talk. Okay, so just because it was reported doesn't mean that it's accurate or up to date. Okay, the next problem is dates. To me, when I look at the CVE data, which I do on almost a daily basis, and I'll show you how I do that actually, the dates are really confusing. I want to know assigned, like when a CVE was assigned, when it was published, versus when it was updated. And that information isn't always apparent or obvious, right? I believe there's ways to dig in and get it, but the year is an interesting kind of moniker because we'll be in 2024 and someone will issue a CVE from 2023 because they were a CNA and they had a pre-allocation of CVE numbers and they're like, oh, that's just the next one in the queue. So then you're like, oh my God, what did I miss? How did I miss this vulnerability? It was from 2023. No, they're just like reusing it from older data. So I want to see us keep better track of when a CVE was assigned, when it was made public, and when it was updated. Because the other thing that's very elusive to me is they could be, and I'll go through this in context of open source projects, but I want to know when it was reported, when it was assigned a CVE moniker, and when that was made public. And I don't think we have a great insight into like that time window of when it was made public, right? I want to know the whole history behind the timeline for these. So I think I talked about all that stuff. The next problem is anyone can score using CVSS, right? That was kind of in my little opening story about my vacation. We all have a different opinion as to the severity level of various vulnerabilities or events and a different opinion on the context of those. So what's interesting is there's actually a case where 3 different organizations scored a vulnerability. Now, this happens to be the logo fail vulnerability that was disclosed by Binarly. And what we have is Binarly says it's an 8.2 CVSS, right? CVSS is just a formula. You plug in various aspects or data points on the vulnerability, and you come up with a score. So their score was 8.2. Now, NIST runs NVD. NVD enriches the data from CVE. One of the things they do is assign a CVSS score. Their CVSS score was a 7.8. Now, the CNA, or CVE Numbering Authority, in this case is AMI. Everyone's seen the splash screen on their BIOS. It flashes up AMI. This is a vulnerability in AMI's UEFI BIOS. Their score was 7.5. Now we can, they're the ones that wrote the software, so, don't want to call your baby ugly, therefore their scores are much lower. Now the folks that found it want to say, this is really super critical because we spent all this time finding it, and I get that too. And then, you got like NIST somewhere in between. So what do? Do we average these together? Do we calculate our own scores? It all becomes very confusing, but we don't want, so what I don't want, it's like a double-edged sword, right? I do want the openness that anyone can score it, because I don't want the other end of the spectrum where only one organization is allowed to score it, because then it's only their biases that we would inherit in all of these scores. So I don't have like a great solution right here other than you have to score it yourself, and I've got some information towards the end about that. Okay. Not all vulnerabilities get a CVE. What's interesting is Josh Corman and I both talked about this probably like 10 plus years ago. We were just happened to be doing research into CVE, and we both came to the conclusion that, wow, like a lot of stuff doesn't get a CVE. So I have some examples for you. The Squid proxy. There was, I believe, a person and or group that looked at a bunch of vulnerabilities in Squid proxy. Does anyone want to admit they run Squid proxy? I mean, you may be running it in your environment and you may not know it because it could be embedded inside of your appliance, which is even scarier. But there were a ton of vulnerabilities found in the Squid proxy that never got fixed. They never got a CVE, and they never got fixed. Now, they're working with the project. Is this the one that said it took years? This is the one that was just, they were all discovered in this version. Nearly every single component was vulnerable. And if you go read the article, like it basically says 80% of these vulnerabilities, I believe, were not addressed. So they never got a CVE. Free RDP is another one. For a time span of about 2 years, these vulnerabilities were identified but not fixed, which is also kind of scary because I'm going to show you some tips and tricks on how to go find vulnerabilities, maybe before they get a CVE or before that CVE becomes public. And these are the methods that I used to discover that someone had discovered a vulnerability in the Linux software shim. I believe I was like the first person to figure out that that existed, or at least publicized it and made a kind of a big deal about it, and it turned out to be kind of a big deal. And it falls in this category of, yes, it was identified, like there was a git commit somewhere, and there was a CVE issued, but like it hadn't been brought to light. This is a case where this stuff wasn't being fixed for 2 years. So like no CVEs existed because the bugs weren't being fixed. And there's a whole article about free RDP that's really good that you should check out. This is an interesting one. This vulnerability was discovered by researchers at Eclypsium. I had a little bit of a hand in this as well as I started poking around and getting curious about Zixil firmware and passed it off to our awesome research team. And our research team says, well, there is this service called ZTP. It's like a setup protocol for Zixil firewalls. And it turns out there was a vulnerability in a particular version of their firmware with the ZTP protocol. Now, what Zixil said was, well, we're not really, they fixed it, but they fixed it by removing that feature, that software from their firmware and issuing new firmware. And they said, well, we're not going to issue a CVE for this. And I'm like, well, hold on, time out. Like, can we all agree that if there's a vulnerability in a piece of software, that it should get a CVE? That makes sense to everyone, right? Vulnerability in software gets a CVE. Apparently not to folks like Zixil, because there's a vulnerability in their software. Now, they fixed it by removing the component and never publicized that there was a CVE. Like, there's still a vulnerability in that particular version of their firmware, but there's no CVE tied to it. So that puts customers, in my opinion, at a disadvantage because you could see that there's an update available for your appliance and go, well, it's just some minor bug fixes, triage it and go, I'm not going to apply the update. When, lo and behold, inside of that could be an important security update for your appliance. Okay, some other examples, and I pull these from a lot of my time when I worked at Tenable, and we would have checks for things that didn't have a CVE, and it was kind of hard for me to determine, like, what's the best coverage to for my network when I run a vulnerability scan, and it's hard to measure that because there are things that don't get CVEs, like weaker default passwords, backdoors. I mean, sometimes backdoors Mr. Potato Head, backdoors are not secrets. Anyone get that reference? Misconfigurations that are introduced by the user, right? Sometimes a user configurable option won't get a CVE because it's something that can be turned on or off. And unsupported hardware and software, again, common in IoT appliances. I've seen a trend recently where vulnerabilities are discovered in a particular version of firmware for mostly consumer-based IoT devices. An exploit is developed and published, and the vendor's response is, we don't support that hardware or firmware anymore, and we're not going to issue a fix. And the bad actors go, well, that's great. I'm just going to keep using my exploit. Like, let's go to town, build up Mirai, and we're off to the races until someone replaces that hardware. Okay, so open source patches are public. This is kind of interesting, and there are ways, and I believe GitHub has a facility, they do have a facility for open source projects to be able to hide basically commits that are used to patch very visible or critical things. But for the most part, all patches to open source software are public. They're somewhere in a pull request, they're somewhere in any kind of ticket, PR issue or commit, right? So Aqua Security did some research on this and produced tools, and I thought this was really super interesting, that they defined these, 0 day is the person who maintains the project doesn't know that the vulnerability exists. A 1 day is that it's known to the maintainer. It may have a CVE assigned, which, bless you, may not be published or not, but there's typically a patch available, right? But it hasn't been published, so that's a 1 day. And then they describe a half day, which is known to the maintainer. The information's publicly available on GitHub. Fixes may be in the works, and a CVE may not be assigned. So it's somewhere in between, a 0 day and a 1 day is a half day, if that is making any sense, right? And then you've got different scenarios that basically blend the vulnerabilities known to the maintainer. Maybe a patch is in the works, maybe it's not. Maybe a CVE is assigned, or maybe it's not. So all of these vulnerabilities fall in these different buckets. And if you think about these buckets, you should go, well, I can go look for that because Git commits are public. So they wrote a tool, and they called it CVE Half-Day Watcher. And you can run this tool, and it will go through, based on CVE. So I believe a CVE has to be issued for this particular project to work. And it'll go point out and go, you know what, that commit right there, I believe fixes a security vulnerability that hasn't been publicized yet. And so I've used that to find, granted with not much success. I do run this tool as part of my, every week looking at vulnerabilities, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. We can also look at, and I don't know if this particular project does it, but I've seen other folks either propose or start working on stuff that looks at commits and looks at the language inside of the commit and goes, that could be fixing a security vulnerability that maybe no one knew about before. So obviously there's a lot of commits on GitHub, and that's a huge endeavor, but certainly possible to look at these commits. Okay, tracking supply chain vulnerabilities is super hard, and we've had some examples recently of this, right? Now I want to go back. I mean, obviously everyone has heard about XZ, which was the recent one, but I want to go back for a bit, and the libwebp vulnerability was a very interesting one in this context. And what happened was Google and Microsoft both realized that their products contained a vulnerable libwebp library. They both fixed that issue, and since they're both CNAs, they were able to assign a separate CVE for each of those products. The problem is that CVE is not necessarily a vulnerability in Chrome, it's a vulnerability in libwebp. And in my opinion, should be tracked as such. Now, I'm not saying this is easy, right? But we should go, the vulnerability and the CVE issued for it is for libwebp. And all the software that's affected in the CPE, or Common Platform Enumeration, I propose, be updated to say, this is yet another platform that's vulnerable because it includes this library, right? That's not how it works today. However, I think we should have a system to track these supply chain vulnerabilities so that we know what's vulnerable based on the library, not based on the platform that library is included in. Now, we did all agree previously, right? I have it on video. We all agreed the CVE should be issued for when there's a vulnerability in a piece of software, except when it's a big enough backdoor, and then we issue a CVE for it. So, but if we did that for XZ, which got a CVE, which is not a vulnerability, it's a backdoor, we should do it for all the backdoors, shouldn't we? Do we all agree? Maybe we can talk about it over beers. I like that. That's fun, right? Okay. How do we track severity and impact changes? This one is well, this one's really funny because I get to make a joke because there was a vulnerability in the Owl camera, and I'm like, that was a hoot. Get it? But also, and you thought Kevin's jokes were bad. So what happened with the Owl vulnerability was CISA came out and said, look, there is a known exploited vulnerability in Owl cameras. And I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting. And then I started digging into it. I'm like, oh, they're saying that Wi-Fi and Bluetooth vulnerabilities that were discovered by researchers that are referenced in that article were spotted in the wild as being exploited. And I'm like legit excited at this point. I'm like, this is awesome. Like all the time, mostly Larry and I have said, if you've got Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, an attacker's going to take over it. They don't necessarily need physical proximity. They can use other devices to jump over to those devices. I'm like, this is awesome. Now we can say it's happening in the wild. I'm like, Larry, this is great. And then next couple of days go by. I'm like, Larry, remember what I said about the Owl thing, or forget what I said? CISA came back and said, no, they really weren't observed in the wild. So the severity and impact of this vulnerability changed. And how did we track that? Did the CVSS score change? I mean, the KEV was updated, so that certainly did serve its purpose and track this change. But for a while, we thought Owl cameras were being exploited in the wild. Turns out there wasn't enough evidence of that. There was also an unauthenticated remote vulnerability in ASUS routers. This one's super interesting because the researcher said, look, this is an unauthenticated remote code execution, command injection, I believe, exploit, right? And it works, and it's a very high severity because it's an unauthenticated RCE. And when this particular researchers looked at it, they said, well, that's only true if you're running an emulation, because the researchers who discovered the original vulnerability discovered it by running the firmware in emulation. When you run firmware in emulation, one of the things you have to emulate is NVRAM. It's a piece of storage, typically on the SPI flash, that contains certain variables and configuration data. When you run it in emulation, it behaves differently. When you run it on actual hardware, it turns out it's not an unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability. It's authenticated. So the severity changed differently, right? Severity can change in either direction, and there's some examples of that. And so it's a constant process now for us to track these changes in severity. There's also a long history of really popular vulnerabilities that have changed in their severity, right? We'd go back to Eternal Blue. I mean, there was no public exploit. So we all assumed, well, no public exploit. I don't have to rush to patch that until there was a public exploit, and then you really did have to rush to patch that. And probably the only one on here that you didn't have to rush to patch was Spectre and Meltdown. Again, I put that on there for academic purposes. I haven't seen in the wild exploitation of specific Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities. If someone would like to correct me if I'm wrong, I am all ears. I'd love to have that conversation over beers. Okay, the state of NIST NVD program. Originally, I was going to spend a lot of time on this, and then my good friends Josh Bressers and others did like had a field day describing what's happening at NIST, and so I don't want to knock NIST. I don't want to knock MITRE. That's not why I'm up here. I think we all need to work together to solve the problems that I've outlined already, right? And so basically, I'll summarize, but you can go read all of these articles if you want. They're all really good. But the summary is like, basically, we need this enriched data, right? We need MITRE or someone to be able to handle the issuing of CVEs. We need yet another body, perhaps, to do the enrichment of that data, to give it CVSS scores in an unbiased manner, to assign CPE or common platform enumeration. Also, to use, to score it on EPSS, Exploit Predictability Scoring System, which uses a machine learning algorithm to determine how exploitable, what's the probability of an exploit being used against this vulnerability. Now, I don't want to knock EPSS, because I think that's a great usage of machine learning, quite frankly. I don't think we should knock it because it's machine learning. I think the program just doesn't get enough updates to it. It doesn't have the resources it needs to be a valuable metric that we can use to help us address and assess the severity of vulnerabilities. And so what people are saying is we need more resources. We need to appoint non-biased organizations that have enough resources to do this. What we have right now is NVD program doesn't have enough resources in order to continue. Now, there's two reasons for that. Just don't think like, oh, my tax dollars are going to waste, like they haven't hired enough people. We've also gotten way better at finding vulnerabilities and producing more software which has more vulnerabilities. So the problem is compounded by more vulnerabilities and resource constraints. Okay, now we'll go through the proposed solutions. How much time do I have? Okay, good. Okay, so my proposed solutions, don't trust the version numbers, ignore dates, generate your own scores, my favorite slide is coming up. I'm so excited. I'll tell you when we get there. Assume there's 0 days. Find non-CVE vulnerabilities through intelligence and testing. I'll actually show you some methods I use to do that. Generate your own SBOMs. Prove something is exploitable. And we all need to work together to improve those various programs. Okay, so affected versions and publication dates are important, and I use an open source tool called CVE Maker, and I run the command within there called critical, and this gives me, now this date is kind of skewed when I took the screenshot. I try and run this tool like every other day. Qualcomm released a whole bunch of critical vulnerabilities on the day that I ran this, so therefore you see that, but what you get is the criticality listed by criticality, the last 20 or so CVEs by updated date, not by when they were issued, not by the published, not by any of those other dates. So if someone goes back in and updates a CVE entry from 2013, it will show up in my list when I run this command. So I kind of like, now also it may show me stuff that I don't care about, but it's a useful tool. And I have full instructions and documentation on how to find this tool and set it up in a slide that's coming up, I promise. CVE Map is another tool that I use to look at CVE data. This was published by Project Discovery, and it slices and dices, a little different. This is by when it was issued, and it allows me to add certain fields, right? So I can say, show me all the latest critical CVEs, and critical, I believe, is 8.0 or greater. And then I can say, show me the fields for KEV, if it has a KEV associated with it, and if you've observed a proof of concept, right? That's useful information as well. Gives you a lot more context, rather than just a CVSS score. It also tells you some extra information. So I like this tool as well. Okay, now we get to the fun part. It's my favorite slide, because I thought about, given all of these problems, and all of these data points and solutions, how would you evaluate the severity of a particular vulnerability in your environment? So what I came up with was Paul's vulnerability patching matrix, which I based on a really funny video that now is like highly inappropriate, so I've cleaned it up so that it's appropriate and applicable to evaluating the vulnerability severity in your environment. So what we end up with on the left-hand side here is vulnerability severity, right? The severity goes from 4 to 10, because basically if it's less than a 4, in my mind it's not a vulnerability. Then on the bottom, we've got organizational impact, on 0 to 10. And I put a little operational risk with a subtraction sign. If there's operational risk, you should kind of back that off. Lower your score a little bit, right? Because if it's going to mess things up in production, then you probably want to prioritize it a little differently, right? So operational risk is a factor here. So what we get is if you're between a 0 and a 5 organizational impact, you're in the no big deal zone, right? If it doesn't matter if it's a CVSS 10.0, if you don't have that software in your environment, if you don't use that particular configuration to make it vulnerable, whatever the case may be, that's no big deal, right? Now, if you're between a 5 to an 8 organizational impact and you're in like the 7-ish, 4 to 7-ish zone, that's your patching fun zone, right? You can patch, you can not patch, you can kind of take your time and evaluate. Where the patching danger zone comes in is if your organizational impact is 5 to 8, but the vulnerability severity is less than a 7, you could be wasting your time, right? You could be patching things that really just don't matter that much in terms of protecting against attackers. Now, where this changes, if you haven't figured out right now, this is based on the hot, crazy matrix. If you go back and watch that, you'll laugh at that and then hopefully also laugh at what I present here. But, and I've made changes that, 8 to 10 is you basically want to patch now, right? Like regardless, if your organizational impact, is 8 to 10, the vulnerability severity just doesn't matter. If it's impactful to your organization, if there's a medium 5, a medium 6, and a 7 that can be strung together, which happens a lot, you need to patch those, right? So patch now is based solely on organizational impact. So that was my kind of take on how you should think about generating your own scores. Don't get too fancy. Just use Paul's vulnerability patching matrix, which you can all have for free. Finding non-CVE vulnerabilities through intelligence. So we can use threat and vulnerability feeds. Both open source and commercial options do exist. We can use pen testing as a service or attack surface management in many shapes, forms, and flavors to constantly assess our attack surface independent of whether there's a CVE or not. And monitor your feeds on your own to find things that are vulnerabilities that could impact your organization that don't have a CVE. Well, how do we do that? I use a tool called Feedly. Feedly is an RSS aggregator, and I know a lot of people probably stopped using RSS aggregators when Google stopped theirs or maybe don't use them anymore. I still use Feedly as my RSS aggregator, and I subscribe to a lot of different exploit and vulnerability feeds, right? I mean, I've basically spent 19 years curating this list. I'm also giving all of my feeds away for free. There's a link in the presentation. You can download in an OPML format all of my feeds that I follow. So if you're looking at this list going, how do I recreate that? You're just going to go to my website and download it, and you can bring it into any RSS reader. Now, I follow exploit feeds and vulnerability feeds, not so much that I'm going to read every single one. One of the powers of Feedly, even in the business plan that isn't that expensive before you get to enterprise, in this plan, you can create AI searches inside of it. And the AI searches will search your existing feeds. So I basically load my feeds with a bunch of like really noisy things in hopes that when I create a search for something, it'll pick out what I'm looking for from these feeds, basically. Okay, and so I've done this with appliances. So I want to know network-based appliances, any kind of vulnerability or research or exploit, any security-related thing to a network appliance that comes from a whole list of companies, right, that I list right here. I want to know about them. And oftentimes, I can find the disclosure of these first, right? So I'm feeding my threat research team at my day job. I'm doing my podcast going, yep, there was another vulnerability in, what was it before I went on vacation? I think it was Palo Alto, which was the one before I went on vacation, right? And so I can see that here. I also subscribe to the ones that have their own RSS feeds as well. as typically that will be the early indicator. I also use Feedly to subscribe to mailing lists as well. So it has this feature where you can subscribe to a mailing list through Feedly. It generates a random email address and creates an RSS feed from that email list, which is an awesome feature. So sometimes, like Checkpoint says, if you want information about our advisories, subscribe to our mailing list. Well, I just convert that into a feed. Okay, you can also look for half-day vulnerabilities, and this is how I use the CVE half-day scanner, right? You need to create a GitHub token, so you need an API token from GitHub, and I'm just using some command line kung fu to dump that file out. And I want to look at the last 10 days of commits, and I only want projects that have at least 500 stars. So I'm doing some filtering to get the number down, and then it comes in and it goes, oh, well, this one has a reference to a CVE that maybe hasn't been publicized yet. There's a Git commit that exists for it. There's a CVE, but maybe no one's talking about it yet. Okay, so this is my cheat sheet for how I keep tabs on this. And again, this presentation's already on my website. If you go to securitypodcaster.com, 1M, /presentations, you can find the slides for this because you're going to want this slide. So this is all of my RSS feeds that are there, including now that I realize that there is a folder for cigars. So, I mean, you can use that or not. Then this is the CVE Maker project. And this is how I use the CVE Maker project with a little cheat sheet notes. CVE map, how to install that, and basically the command I run for it, and then also the CVA half-day watcher. So this is like a little cheat sheet of how to keep up with the latest vulnerabilities and exploits. Okay, now, you should also assume that there are 0 days, right? We can't possibly stand here and go, we know about all the vulnerabilities that exist. So what you're going to do is you're going to get the latest next-generation AI-enhanced, multi-layered, cutting-edge, zero-day threat protection solution. Then you're going to throw it in the trash. And then you're going to build a solid InfoSec program, which is a completely different talk, which I haven't developed yet. But if you want it, I mean, I can work on it. It's fine. You also want to generate your own SBOMs. There's been some interesting work in critical infrastructure. There was, I forget which particular subsector in critical infrastructure said, look, we want to go to all of our vendors for all of our equipment in the OT part of our operation, and we want to ask them for an SBOM. And what most vendors said was, well, no. And some said maybe, and some said yes. And so what they did was, for those that said no, they said, well, fine, we're going to go generate our own SBOM. And they did. And it works, and it's totally possible. So for the vendors out there that are going, well, you can't possibly ask us to generate an SBOM, that's not possible. Well, I don't even need you to generate an SBOM. I can generate my own. Now, I would like it if the vendors generated their own SBOM, and I generated the SBOM, and then I compared them, because I don't trust a lot of people. This is a trust issue we have here in our industry today, right? And one of the ways, I work a lot with firmware, working at Eclypsium, and one of the great projects is Emba. And Emba will take firmware and do all kinds of things with it, but one of the things it will do is generate an SBOM and tell you what software packages are inside of that firmware. So if you take a particular piece of firmware, I can't give any recent examples. If you go find firmware on the internet, over beers, I can tell you more. But if you go find firmware on the internet and you run it through Emba, and it's like lifting up the hood on an old car, lifting up the covers, and you go, ah, and you put it back down. That's basically my experience running firmware through things like Emba. There's a free from Anchor container SBOM. There's Java SBOMs. As well as an SBOM tool from Microsoft. So there's lots of resources out there for you to generate SBOMs. You should use Google's OSV. Now, I was looking at Google's OSV, and I really liked it. I looked at a lot of projects that could help with these problems that I outlined in the first half of the presentation. 7 minutes, okay. So, and Google's OSV was one that came up, and as a valid source, I thought, because what they're doing is they're cataloging open source software and their vulnerabilities, and they're doing it really well. They're addressing many of the problems that I addressed in the beginning and creating a database for open source software and libraries that is affiliated with vulnerabilities. And they've made it available in an API. I believe mostly targeted at developers that you can build into your build process. Hey, look, I observed this library. Go out to Google's OSV. Go see if that library has vulnerabilities, pull them back in, and work it into your build plan. So I was kind of digging Google's OSV. I thought, and they released it a while ago. When did it come out? It came out a while ago. So definitely check that out. You need to prove something is exploitable, right? I think we kind of get hung up on this exploit thing. And is it known exploitable in the wild? Does an exploit exist? Have we observed a threat actor using the exploit? Is the exploit a proof of concept, or does the exploit actually work? How well does the exploit work? Should I only patch things that have an exploit, or ones we've already just seen in the wild? I think we just get kind of hung up on that. I think we should go back to Paul's vulnerability matrix. And if it's an 8 to 10 impact, I think we should patch it. And that's way more simplified than patching based on exploits. However, looking for exploitable vulnerabilities using CVE Maker is really fun too. Because you can do a search, and it'll search the CVE catalog, and it'll give you the last 20 or so results that contain that keyword. And then it will go through all the exploit databases and look for exploits against those particular CVEs. Now, this is not only useful for defenders, but if you're on the offensive side, pretty useful as well. But I really like this particular search keyword term, because I'll just kind of pop in, because a lot of times, like, I feel like I missed something. Like I was on vacation, as an example. Like, I feel like I missed something. So I'll go back in this tool and I'll go search BMC, right? Baseboard management controllers, run firmware. They're in our purview, at Eclypsium. I'm like, I want to know if there's been any new CVEs or exploits against anything that has a BMC in it, because I might have missed it, and this will bring it up. So props to whoever wrote CVE Maker. I didn't get the person's name, but I've been using it, and I think it's a great project. Okay, so we all need to work together to help improve these programs. I think a lot of the agencies and sectors within the government are working really hard, thank you, sir, to address these problems and challenges. You don't work for these, but in a different area, but thank you. So we all need to support these programs. We all need to figure out how we can help. I've personally been reaching out to contacts that I know that work in these agencies and going like, look, how can we help? So there is going to be, and I'll put this on my social media when it happens, there's going to be like a call for a committee to help these things that'll be posted. There are job openings now that I learned about just this afternoon, where they're looking for people to help and fill positions to help these programs, right? CVE, CVSS, EPSS. We need to have independent, non-biased programs that run these, because we rely on this data too much to let it fall in the hands of commercial vendors. Now, a lot of commercial vendors, and look, I don't want to knock the commercial vendors, I don't blame them, are coming up with their own scoring systems. They're coming up with their own CVE tracking. And some of them are doing a great job, quite frankly, but we don't want that bias, right? We want this, in my opinion, to be a community effort. Okay, now some good news is that we see, so these are like 3 things I observed that I think represent good news for us in this context, given all the problems at hand. 1, Microsoft is adopting the CWE program. If you noticed, the last round of patches for April, Microsoft's description of these vulnerabilities looked very different. It kind of took me some time to get used to, but they also included common weaknesses enumeration, or CWE, and so they've adopted some of that. This, I think, is a positive thing, right? Microsoft's not running the CWE program, but they're adopting that program for their vulnerabilities. There was also 34 vulnerabilities in Secure Boot, which they fixed in the latest Patch Tuesday update, and I wrote a blog on that, which you should read. So there. But there is, what if there's no patch available for end-of-life products? So there is the Center for Cybersecurity Policy that has released a paper that is advising companies on what to do for end-of-life products. And so in one of the recommendations that they made, I love this because this really grinds my gears, is separate critical security fixes for customers and not bundle those patches with new product features or functionality changes. Hooray! Like, please, can we get here? Yes, I want to install version 4.2, but I want to do that in my own time. If that contains security fixes, I just want those security fixes. I don't want to have to regression test and implement a whole bunch of new features if I don't have to. Like your new iPhone. Yeah, Apple's notorious for that. So there are being improvements also are coming from Scientia Institute. Oops. In improving the EPSS. I really hope this goes through. I really hope we get an organization to help keep this enrichment data up to date, because I think it definitely has legs. It just needs a little tender love and care. Okay, and that concludes the presentation. You can get the slides, securitypodcaster1m.com presentations, and yeah, that's it. I guess thank you. I got like 1 minute for questions. Does anyone have any beer? No? Okay. Yes. Yeah, I think that's an absolutely valid point, and it depends on the audience, right? As a consumer, we may, if it's possible to skip those security patches, we might, in favor of the features, right? I think as consumers, we gravitate towards features. I think in an IT department, we might look at that differently, right? We may say, I want the security fixes. I don't want to incur the operational risk of new features and security fixes in one. I want to be able to separate them, right? So I think your point is completely valid. I think I would separate into different audiences, right? Questions? Yes. Yeah, I think largely, I don't know, I'm kind of biased. So I own a Tesla, and I get new software all the time, right? But I think I've spoken with people about the overall security of all the vehicles, that we have here in the U.S. And Tesla has had a bug bounty program for a long time and done a really good job at pushing out updates and responding to security vulnerabilities and pushing them out. Now, they're not the only ones. There are others as well, but it's a spectrum just like anything else. Some are really good at dealing with updates and pushing them out, and some are really bad. I think overall technology has evolved to do that, but we also see a lot of recalls in the automotive industry as well, which we don't see. Like, I want a recall for my network appliance, right? That in, I think 2 different cases, I won't name the vendors, have said you need to replace your devices, right? I mean, effectively, that was a recall. So I think the recall model is applicable. All right. I'll be around if anyone has questions. We're 2 minutes over, but thank you all for coming to my talk.